Sorry, we're about 5 minutes behind the schedule. We'll make it up. Peter's going to be talking about accessibility evaluation tools.
Hi folks, I'm going to talk about web accessibility. This quote sort of resonate with the from Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web. So it's kind of web accessibility has always been there from the very beginning. It's not something to come up now with like digital inclusiveness. Part of the thinking of accessible internet. Bit about me. So I'm a senior software engineer. Work for Grail. Grail is a blood testing company for cancer, and I live in Cambridge. I had to take the train here today to speak to you guys. Spent some time at Google and I'm researching. I'm doing a PhD in web accessibility. Just for the heck of it. This is what I'm going to cover today. So unlike the other talks you've been to, this is not about culture. This is not about change management. It's about the tool, right? And you could have Googled these tools, but I'm going to give you a perspective of why these tools are important. And I'll also discuss some of the limitations of these tools at the end. If there are limitations. And hopefully we'll leave this session with some thoughts about what you can do next in your projects. Because web accessibility is important. And why it's important. I've done a slide last year at PyCon UK, and I've had to update this number from 1 billion to 1.3 billion. So basically, more and more people on the planet globally are having some form of disability. These numbers are quite recent, so 16 million UK disabled. When we think of disabled people with disabilities, it also affects children, right? So we're looking at a large population of people who have disabilities, and some of these disabilities are like hidden impairments. They're not necessarily like someone very simply think of as being disabled. And the good news or bad news is because we're living older, we're getting older and we have good medicine and cancers can be detected earlier in those things. It means we're actually living, population growth is causing more people. So hands up, who knows what these are? These are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Okay, about 10% of the room. They're split into four principles. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These are in UK law and EU laws, and we'll come on to that. But essentially, from these principles, there are a set of guidelines, 13 at the moment. And from these guidelines, there are success criteria which your application, web application, should conform to. And the performance levels are split into A, AA, and AAA. And as of last year, it basically adopted a EU legislation to mean in the UK, when these guidelines update, which they will do at the end of Q3, we automatically get ingrained into law for public websites, things like the NHS and universities and pharmacies, those sort of things. So interesting space. There were 3 different types of evaluating an accessible website. So the first one's automated testing, manual inspection, and user testing. Now I would actually add a 4th one on here, which is semi-automated, which we'll come on to. What is semi-automated? Is if you have a browser plugin, you still need a human to look at that browser, right? Those definitions could be challenged. But, I do respect Absco and research he's done in that book. Automated testing, I'm not going to read this all out to you, but 167 tools are actually maintained in the W3C. So they sort of maintain lists. And as you can see, 167 tools, you may think that's a large number. But given a population of 1.3 billion disabled people, that's quite a low number of tools that we have in this space. But from those tools, I'll discuss ones you should know about, right? Because I'm not going to expect you to go through all 167 and evaluate them. Actually, one thing I'll mention on here, most of these tools assess against guidelines. So the guidelines are the web content accessibility ones. We could discuss or argue whether they're good guidelines or whether the other ones should be used, but these are the ones that industry leaders at Microsoft and other places have decided are good guidelines to put into legislation. Manual inspection. So this is actually quite hard to do in practice because you need to hire someone who knows the guidelines really well. So there's not loads of people who do that. And it's quite a time-consuming process because you have to go through the guidelines, understand them really well, So anyone who's doing accessibility seriously would employ people who do this. So that's the first thing I'm going to say about the tools. Manual inspection is really important, and we'll come on to why a bit later in the day. User testing is the golden standard, but from my experience, it rarely happens. So user testing is when you actually observe how someone uses your application. And this is someone in the target population you're targeting. For example, where I currently work at the moment, we're working with the NHS, and they're essentially focusing on millions and billions of people who will be accessing. So getting accessibility is correct. Your target audience, when you start going outside of the working population, you start needing to consider some of those people. These are the tools I'm going to talk about today. I don't expect you to remember these logos, but just so you're familiar with what they look like from a marketing perspective. First one's Wave. Now, Wave is used widely. It's basically available as a browser plugin. Download it now and use it. There is an API you can use, but the API, they do charge you for credits. And so the credits do cost some sort of money, and that goes to Utah University. And the good thing about Wave, it looks like this, right? This is ChatGPT's website, and it finds some sort of errors. I'm not going to show what those errors are, but there's a nice interface, easy to use, and you can literally get it running within a minute. And you can find accessibility issues. A-Checker is, what I'm going to mention here is those of these tools are actually quite old. They're like 20 years old, some of them. And that's kind of the space of accessibility testing tools. None of these are really using AI, right? And I want to highlight that because I think, so none of these are using artificial intelligence. I think one or two are, but starting to come into that space. And I think it's quite sad that these tools have sort of been left behind a little bit. So A-Check is really popular. It's because there's loads of papers which reference it. So there's loads of understanding of its limitations, why it's good. So it's a good tool from that perspective. The bad perspective is it only supports CAG 2.0, which is an old standard. It's a good sort of reference check in that perspective. So that's the interface. You just go to a browser and enter it, and the report is quite nice as well. Shows you the errors, specifically accessibility, and also the ones which are potential errors that need human evaluation. SortSite is one of my favorites. It's developed in Edinburgh. One thing about SortSite, which the other tools don't seem to do, is you just give it a website and it goes off and scans all sorts of pages automatically, which is very nice. The other tools I've mentioned, Wave and A-Checker, just are page per page. So that sort of limits your sample size on how you're going to evaluate your website. The other thing I mentioned about SortSite is this is what it looks like. It's a desktop application. You have to install it. It's a licensed product. It's not for free. Don't work for SortSite, but it's a nice product. And yeah, that's a nice tool. Definitely being in the toolbox. One that's used a lot. This is open source, Axe. I know Google use it in Lighthouse, which I'll come on a few slides ahead. Very open source, nice tool, nice project. My feeling of Axe is it doesn't find as many issues as some of the other tools, but it's a very nice tool to keep in your tool chain. And the reason for that is there's a browser plugin, which you can look at the Wikipedia website for web accessibility. It's found a few issues, and there's also integration with a lot of UI testing tools like Cypress, WebDriver.io, and Playwright. And this is the value of using Axe, because you can put it into your test automation suite like now and find issues. So a lot of other tools don't have that sort of integration with UI testing frameworks. So it's quite nice to see that Axe have that. So that's one. I've done this talk internally, and the developers were asking, how do we get this running? And this is a slide which shows you how you do that, because it's like, it's built into all these tools. Tor is also very popular, especially for Spanish-speaking websites and Portuguese. Seems to come up in the literature review a lot, so a lot of papers reference it. It's been around for a very long time, and I emailed the developer who needs to quote it to me. First one came out in the year 2000. You can see how old some of these tools are. And I think what I like about Tor is the user interface. So if you go to the report, you get this nice sort of dashboard and there's nice reporting. The issue is if you go back to here, the rate limiting on this is really bad. So you can't access loads of pages and you've got to be careful with your sample set. And obviously, if you want to automate this, you'd have to use UI automation. So it's not really designed for that. There is a desktop application as well, which is available, but it's only there's only support for WCAG 1, so the first version of the content accessibility guideline. This tool is very different from the other tools. It doesn't assess all of the success criteria, so it's very focused on the non-contrast, basically, foreground and background. It's used a lot. It's used by GDS for testing for colour blindness, and it's quite a simple tool to use. There are like other ones available on the web. This one's quite popular. It's available for Windows and Mac. You can also simulate colour blindness, and you can see here, like, you know, it shows you on this particular one on the right some of the failures for the basic content accessibility guidelines. So these ones don't match. The contrast levels are expected, ratio one. So Google Lighthouse, you could argue I've duplicated this. It's using Axe under the hood, but it's built into Chrome. So you've got it for free already if you're using Chrome. And the good thing about this is it doesn't just test accessibility. It tests a whole bunch of things like search engine optimization, performance, blah, blah, blah. The downside thing with Google Lighthouse is it's not very technical in the sense of showing you the violations if there's any barriers in your web application against the web content accessibility guidelines. It doesn't tell you what the barriers are back to the guidelines. So it's kind of like an easy, accessible tool that developers should use anyway and run. But it's maybe not so good for formal evaluation against the compliance reasons. So still another tool to put in your toolbox. And this is what it looks like if you're running it. You can run it on the command line as well. But this is obviously if you launch Chrome, it gives you a score. So what tool should you use, right? I've shown you some tools. And in 2013, LIGO came up with these metrics, like how completeness and correctness. So the first one is how much coverage the success criteria is covered. Like if you pick a tool, how many rules does it have, essentially? And the other ones are for testing for false positives and false negatives. And a lot of research has shown that even if a tool has a lot of coverage, it actually has a reduced sense of reliability in terms of accuracy, in terms of giving you false positives and negatives. So that's also interesting to know. So what should you do? And the first thing you should not do is replace humans, right? So you should definitely still have human evaluation, and we'll come on to why. But LIGO's also done a study where he found, and this is an old study, and this kind of shows you the space, that there aren't loads of studies happening in this space. In 2013, he evaluated 6 of the current tools at the time, and only 50, so from those tools, one of them only found 50% of the success criteria. So that's the sort of coverage levels that were being displayed. I've looked at a study which was published, I think 2 months ago, I can't remember, that number is like now 44%, I think. You can see there's a lot of success criteria which is not covered by those tools, and that's you picking the right tool. And then if you pick the tool which has most of the coverage, you're going to ask yourself, does it actually have correctness and completeness? What's the answer to this? One answer, one solution is to do a study and to find out the limitations of those tools and then combine them so that you know, so you kind of get like an ensemble of tools, right? And some studies are suggesting 10% more coverage, which is quite nice from running a single tool, but that's providing you pick the right tools. But if you look at the literature quite carefully, you can also see that multiple tools, like evaluating, combining all of them to like summarize the results and aggregate results in those tools, can be challenging. And one reason for this is because these tools don't always output in the same standard or same format. Some of these are desktop applications, some are APIs, and some are browser plugins, right? So getting a standard format where if you get an error in one tool, it's exactly the same error in another tool. That's kind of one of the challenges we have. And there are standards around these things, but they just haven't been adopted from like 10 years ago. So I've done a study with my supervisor when I was at Google, and I ran some of these tools, Wave, Sort Site, Access Monitor, and Axe, there were reasons I picked those tools, mainly because they supported WCAG 2.1, and they were frequently being used on the literature review I did. So that seemed like a good reason to choose them. I'm not going to go through all of the methodology around that, but what I want to show you from that paper is at the bottom row, you can see these tools are supposed to be evaluating the same guidelines on the same website. And you can see the variation in errors that are being reported. So I've deliberately not put what the tools are because I don't want to show that for sensitive reasons, but you can see using multiple tools and summarizing and aggregating that data is a useful technique, and it needs more research. So in summary, a single tool, this is my recommendation, a single tool is not recommended. Tools vary in the violations of the success criteria, like they report, as I was just showing you on that previous table, and results of multiple tools can be aggregated and summarized. And I haven't seen this done a lot, so there's more work in this area to be done. And yeah, at the bottom line, or the final bullet point now is human evaluation is still very important. So you still can't replace all of your automated testing, accessibility testing, like you can't fully replace that with human. And that's like my team are asking me from a different project. It's like, how can we actually, are running tools enough? And the answer is no. So that wasn't good news for them. Have some references there if you're interested in some stuff I've quoted. But yeah, it's a short talk. That's all I had. So if you've got any questions, fire away. Yeah.
In your recommendation, you suggested multiple tools, the best way to go, but of course, the budget constraints, we can't ask budget to the twice for the same ask. So if the recommendation includes something free and something paid for?
Right. Yeah. So here I've used Wave, SortSci, Access Monitor. Most of these are actually open source.
Okay.
I think Wave, in this case, I used the API, which I technically I got for free, so I was doing a study. SortSci I also got for free because I was doing a study. So I used two commercial tools, and Access Monitor and Axe, as I've just shown, are open source. So it's like 50-50 in that case.
Okay.
Yep.
I know we're focused mainly on web-based things. Do you have any recommendations for anything like email recommendation, anything else we can use in our day-to-day life that we probably wouldn't think of usually?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Sorry.
That's the answer. The truth is I've just focused on web accessibility because there's a big space. You can look at mobiles and there's a whole bunch of different tools on mobile. And so I've just focused on web, mainly because I'm working on the web app. But it's a good answer, a good question. I don't have the answer.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What's your PhD hypothesis?
I haven't got a PhD yet, but I'm doing one in web accessibility around integrating that into the development process. Right, so how do you get a combined approach? And also using that paper, which I've done, using that as a basis to kind of build on and ask. I don't know yet, right? I'm still figuring out. Yeah.
Do you turn all of these requirements that the tools use into real test scripts so that the testers in the team can use? So do you translate the WCAG guidelines into test scripts?
So when you're using these tools, someone's done that work for you and has created a rule. And this is the kind of issue with using a single tool, because you've taken someone's assumptions. We talked about requirements and assumptions before. So someone's assumed, some basics around what the requirements are saying, created some rules, and then that's one implementation of that. So if you use multiple implementations, so you can start to get more interpretations of those requirements and those guidelines. Those guidelines are very generic, right? So maybe we should run them for a tool to check if they're testable. And some of the guidelines are also very hard to detect from machine. For example, for alternative text, you can have ChatGPT have a go at what the image is showing or something like that. But is that a definitive answer, or do you want someone with human reasoning to kind of say that's a cat in the image, so like something ginger or whatever, right? So I think I don't know if that answers your question, but no. So when you use one of these tools, you're assuming someone's done the right work in terms of creating the rules that the tool runs. But there are checklists which I haven't shown on this particular deck, which are manual checklists, which I gave to 5 accessibility experts. I'm not an expert, I'm a software engineer, I work in accessibility, but they went through those checklists and I compared what they found with what the tools found, and they were there as well. So yeah, I think that's one approach actually to use both, to use someone going through the checklists and someone running these tools. Yep.
A lot of the tools, the guidelines came out before we had things like really sophisticated voice interaction with websites and so on. What sort of tools would be good for capturing accessibility from the wider set of interfaces that we've got now, like voice activated monitoring and talking to Siri or whatever it is?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that comes out of these tools being really old and developed 20 years ago. And the space we're in at the moment is there's not a lot of focus on creating good tools. Now, I want to sort of highlight where we are today. We've been using these tools to kind of assess web applications. And I think the new guidelines for 2.2 do encompass some of that, but even still, I think it's been heavily. So the short answer is these tools definitely don't do it. I don't know. I think that's really for manual testing. And any of these tools will do that.
Interesting area for further work.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Any time for more questions? Yeah.
Time or no time?
Yeah, go.
Oh, right, okay. So your talk's mainly on website, right? Okay, so we talk about 2.1 and 2.2, but there's another 3 coming up, right? There's gold, silver, and the ratings. So it's not going to be A, double A, or triple A.
I'm not.
Because it's going to be encompassing a lot more type of disabilities. Are you still going to be focusing on 2.2, or are you going to move towards?
It's an interesting question because at the moment I'm looking at what's actually out there now
All right, okay.
and understanding those limitations, right? And those of these guidelines, like those of these tools don't even support the latest. I think that's the issue we have, right? Because you're limited by, so I mentioned access monitor, A checker. An A checker doesn't even support, those of these tools are heavily used in the literature. They don't even support like the latest guidelines. So like this one's even used today by loads of researchers and they're still testing against old guidelines. So I'm still trying to like understand the limitations of these tools. And these tools don't even support the latest ones. So when we look at new guidelines coming up, it's like it's a whole separate thing. But I've not looked at those standards yet. I've only looked at 3.2.
Can I follow up with them? So, so we're mainly looking at like things have been developed, we've got some guidelines for testing. How can we use that to move it towards at the development stage?
Yeah,
Because it's so late.
that's a good point. Yeah, that's something I'm trying to talk with the UX designer I'm working with. When you got a Figma design, how can you test a Figma design, right? And I don't have the answer for that yet.
Or you have accessibility mode.
What I think is you can't use automated tools on like Figma and like those wireframes. I think that has to be like a design review. You go through a checklist. These tools are more likely to catch regressions during like your CI pipelines. That's my general feeling. But, that's not necessarily the right answer. But
So things like linter to actually check the code as being
it hasn't regressed. So
yeah, so
if they've added a new fee, compliance with the guidelines.
do you know of any? Oh, sorry, third question. I'll leave it later on. Someone else.
You've got 2 minutes. Okay.
Oh, okay. Have you got? Do you know of any tools which actually can do screen reading kind of things? Because I really the screen reading tool, but that obviously requires the human sitting there and they're on going into that mode. It's really quite hard to get into that mode. Is there anything other tools that actually can do that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them.
So screen reading type style.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've not covered them. I've not used them so much. Because I've seen some labs where they have all of that stuff, but the tools I focused on were just like basically Lord answers, well, use ones, go-to ones for. Yeah, when you're testing screen reading, that's a whole different. So that's when you're starting to do human evaluation and user testing, right? So not, this is like where you just run in CI with these tools.
I think that's included.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Might get that simply. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys. Oh, one more question at the back.
How do you see AI improving
So how do I see AI improving these tools?
some of these?
It's a good question. Like, I think at the moment, we don't have any AI. I think one or two tools, I think Acts and it's starting to use AI, but at the moment, we don't have like a good understanding of how AI can help. And I'm sure there's some private companies starting to work on it, but there's nothing that's been published that I've read that is starting to use AI. And I think that could be because academia kind of falls behind from like the sector, private sector, but no one's publishing anything I've read that is using AI for this. Or if they have, they've just done a very small scale study. They haven't published a tool which you can use.